Good evening, and welcome to the April meeting of the Linnean Society of New York. I'm Debbie Mullins, the president, and I call this meeting to order. Thank you for joining us tonight. Spring migration is truly underway now, and on our Central Park walk this morning, we saw nearly 50 species, including 4 warbler species. The Tuesday morning walks will continue through the end of May, so try to come out and join us. As much as we all enjoy migration, it's a dangerous time for birds who must navigate the tall buildings and bright lights of the city. The Lights Out bill that will require buildings to turn off unnecessary lighting during migration will be introduced in the City Council sometime this summer. This year, we're going to make an all-out effort to get this bill finally enacted into law in New York City. Our Spring Birdathon to raise funds for the Great Gull Island Project is May 11th and 12th. You'll be getting an email soon with the sign-up form and all the details. But in the meantime, please save the date and start talking to your friends about forming a team. Last week, you were asked to vote on 2 motions. The first motion, to approve the minutes of the February meeting, were approved by a vote of 129 in favor, 2 abstaining, and none opposed. You also voted to approve the membership applications of 7 new members. The vote was unanimous with 131 in favor and none opposed. Our new members are Caroline Wolf, sponsored by Chuck McAlexander, Joan Felder, sponsored by Ken Chea, Allison Wailagala, sponsored by Elizabeth Kime and Erica Peak, Guy Percival, sponsored by Lisa Krupp, Jennifer Percival, also sponsored by Lisa, Lisa Dettert, sponsored by Karen Becker, and Alexia Fishwick, sponsored by Michelle Zorzi. Welcome to each one of you. We're very happy to have you in the society, and I hope that you'll participate in some of our field trips or other activities. We look forward to getting to know you in person. Membership in the Linnean Society is open to everyone with an interest in birding and the natural world. The membership application is on our website, linneannewyork.org/member. If you don't know anyone in the society, I would be happy to be your sponsor, as would any member of our board of directors. We truly value diversity, and we encourage everyone to join, regardless of age, race, gender preference or identity, or socioeconomic status. All you need is an interest in natural history and a desire to explore those interests with others. So let's now turn to our program. As usual, we've disabled your microphone and the chat function. Please use the Q&A feature to submit questions for Dr. Winger. Following his presentation, Vice President Doug Futuma will moderate a question and answer session. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Ben Winger, Assistant Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of Michigan, where he's also the curator of birds at the university's Museum of Zoology. Ben is an ornithologist and evolutionary biologist with broad interests in the ecology, behavior, and evolution of birds. His research on the evolution of bird migration has won awards from the American Ornithological Society, the Ecological Society of America, and the Society of Systematic Biologists, and has been featured in popular media such as Radio Lab, National Geographic Magazine, and Living Bird. Ben received his BA from Cornell University in 2007 and his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2015. He and his students study a wide variety of questions related to bird speciation, migration, and conservation. So Ben, welcome to the Linnean Society. I'll now turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here today. It's a real honor to be talking to you. I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay. So yes, I'll be talking about the evolution of seasonal migration in birds. But since we already heard about some bird watching outings from today, I'm going to start with first with where I got into all of this, which was years ago when I was a kid. I picked up this book, which some of you may be familiar with. I don't even know if it's in print anymore, but it's a pretty old book at this point. The Golden Guide to Birds. And I was so mesmerized by these little illustrations of all these birds that look so similar. And yet, apparently, experts could tell them apart. That I immediately fell for bird watching. But what really struck me was all the other information that this book had. So these little range maps on the left side of the pages that show where species are supposed to be found and at what times of year. So we can see for each of these warblers, there's a pink blob where they spend their breeding season, and then these hash marks where they are during migration. And these little dashed lines are supposed to indicate about when you might expect to see them. So this Blackburnian warbler, this dashed line indicates it shows up in spring migration about May 1st, right there. Um, Whereas this yellow rump warbler down here, it spends the winter further north, and we can see it earlier in the spring. So I was very fascinated by the fact that there is this sort of all these patterns in these distributions and the timing of these birds. And today, in the decades since the Golden Guide was published, we have a lot more information about these birds. Through sources like eBird, that I'm sure many of you contribute to, we have very good understanding of where and when birds are found throughout the year, such as the Swainson's thrush on the left and the hermit thrush on the right, that both breed in boreal North America, but they spend their winter, the non-breeding season, in very different places. And if you went on this Tuesday walk today, or go on the Central Park walks, I'm sure you're learning that spring bird migration to some extent follows a pretty predictable schedule. So right now, in March and April, in the latitude of New York or in Michigan, where I am now, we can expect to see yellow rump warblers arriving right now. Okay, and these are the birds that don't have that far to travel. Some of them may be even wintering pretty near to New York. Whereas we have to wait about another month to see these spectacular neotropical migrants like this Blackburnian warbler that flies all the way, could be coming from Peru or Bolivia. And so birders await these with great anticipation. You may have thought a little bit less about the departure, which is that the Blackburnian warbler is one of the last ones in, but it's among the first ones out. So by early September, where I live in Michigan, most Blackburnian warblers have already gone south, whereas we get to enjoy yellow rump warblers lingering around for longer. Okay. And so if you've been bird watching for a little while, the timing or the phenology of this probably becomes intuitive to you. It's just something you learn along with how to identify birds. And birders, of course, are seasonal creatures as well. And so pack into places like this is a McGee Marsh in Ohio to see these neotropical migrants arriving. But maybe you thought a little bit less about why. So why do different species have such different schedules? And what I hope to convince you of by the end of the talk is that this question and these migratory patterns of geographic range and timing are very intimately connected to evolutionary processes that have much broader relevance throughout biology and even in our lives. And so specifically, what I'm talking about is something called life history evolution, which is essentially this concept of whether you live fast and die young or not. Okay, so we can think of mice at one end of a life history spectrum where mice produce a lot of babies every year. They develop really quickly, but they have very short lifespans and generations, and they have really high mortality. Okay, so mice certainly live fast and die young. And on the other hand is an animal like an elephant, where in any given year they have few babies, or even over their lifetimes they have few babies. They take a long time to develop, and like us, they have long lifespans, long generation times, but they survive really well. And this is called the slow fast continuum of life history. So we'll come back to that. What I want to talk about today in three parts is first talk about the evolutionary history of bird migration and how we learn about that. We'll get kind of far into the weeds there, so then I want to pull back and ask, well, why do birds migrate? And how did this evolve? Which is one of those questions that becomes more complicated the more you think about it. And finally, we'll return to this question of what our spring birding schedules can teach us about life history and the evolution of migration. Okay. So talking about the evolutionary history of seasonal migration. And where I like to start here is by highlighting one of my favorite migratory species, the black-polled warbler. This is from a study where scientists tracked their migration using these little geolocator backpacks. And these birds bred up in northern Canada and Alaska at the edge of the boreal forest. And they migrate all the way to South America. And they cross the Atlantic Ocean in a rather amazing leap where they may spend 3 or 4 days flying across the Atlantic. Some even fly from Maine all the way down to coastal South America. And this journey kind of awe-inspiring journey has been remarked upon by ornithologists and bird watchers for a long time because of this tremendous oceanic crossing that the birds do. But what I really like to highlight in thinking about the evolution of migration is that this isn't just remarkable because of the journey that the birds make, but because of the different environments that they spend the different parts of the year in. So here we have a species that spends the northern summer in a place that looks like this. It's a boreal forest or taiga. And then in the northern winter, it is just as much at home in tropical forest, where it doesn't breed, but it spends the rest of the year until it's time to come back and breed. And so migration, in a lot of ways, is really a question of biogeography, which is essentially the science of asking why do species live where they do and not in other places, and how did these patterns come to be? So it's just some real basics of biogeography. First of all, we have to remember that the places where species live, that is their geographic ranges, are not permanent. They change, they evolve, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. And this can happen when the environment changes. So this could be the formation and retreat of glaciers or current global warming. And geographic ranges also change because organisms themselves move and adapt. So our little range maps here in the Golden Guide, these capture a particular moment in time where we know these animals are living today, but we don't know very well where they lived in the past. And so it's difficult to understand how these migratory patterns could have evolved. And so the evolution of bird migration in the scientific literature has for about 150 years been kind of a biogeographic dilemma. And the crux of this is asking whether migration evolved through a shift in where species breed, that is in their breeding range, or a shift in their wintering range away from some ancestral range. And I'll talk about what I mean by that in the next few slides. So let's imagine this purple range map here, a species that spends all year round in this location in North America at some point in the past. Okay, so this is its year-round range and an ancestral range. And maybe over time, the location where the species spends the winter moves towards the equator, such that the species now breeds and spends the northern winter in different places and is migratory. Okay, This is one possibility for how migration could evolve by moving that non-breeding location. And this idea has been around for a long time. In fact, Alfred Russel Wallace, who is famous for essentially coming up with the idea of evolution along with Darwin, Wallace wrote about this in a letter to Nature a long time ago, that this is probably how migration evolved. And we can call this the temperate home hypothesis because it hypothesizes that the ancestral home of migratory species was somewhere in the current day temperate zone. Now, on the other hand, we could imagine a different model, and out of the tropics hypothesis, where we consider a species where a long time ago it has an ancestral range in the tropics, and it spends all year round there, but slowly it changes where it breeds and moves that breeding range towards the temperate zone and becomes migratory. Okay, so these are two possible ways in which migration could evolve. And so one of the studies that I did actually as a graduate student was to come up with a way of testing these hypotheses by asking whether bird migration has more frequently evolved through a breeding range shift out of the tropics or a shift of the wintering or non-breeding range out of the temperate zone. So this is actually quite difficult to test because these are things that have occurred over millions of years potentially. And most bird species have a very poor fossil record. Okay, so we can't just, look to fossils to tell us where species were and when. And even if we could, it'd be difficult to understand migration. So we have to use other tools at our disposal to try and do more than just conjecture. Okay, and so one way that scientists go about understanding the past is through phylogenetic analysis. And a phylogeny is simply a tree diagram, such as here, almost like a family tree, that depicts the evolutionary relationships between organisms, in this case, species of buntings. Okay, just as one example. And these are made by, pretty much nowadays, at least trees for birds are made by comparing DNA sequences. So we can examine the genetic relationships between species. And when we see a phylogeny like this, we think of the past as towards the root of the tree and the present as higher up or towards the tips. And we can actually use these phylogenies to learn something about how geographic ranges evolve over a long time period. So these are all the contemporary ranges of these 4 species of buntings. And if we wanted to know, well, where did that ancestral species of bunting live maybe 15 million years ago, we could try to do a phylogenetic analysis to reconstruct this. And we do this by making a model that allows geographic ranges to change gradually through time, which would be along the branch of this tree, or very abruptly when new species are formed. So when one species splits into 2, the geographic ranges of those new species are some subset of the ancestral species. So we can make a model, a mathematical model, to use phylogenies to understand the evolution of geographic range. So I'm not going to go into all the details of how we did this, but essentially collaborators and I developed a method that was kind of novel at the time because we actually used it to reconstruct the evolution of the breeding and the non-breeding or the wintering ranges at the same time in a group of birds to specifically look at the evolution of migration. And so we do this by saying, well, given that we have information about the current geographic ranges of these species and their evolutionary relationships, what's the probability that the ancestral breeding and wintering ranges were in the tropics versus the temperate zone? And this is really a probability question, so we don't have a way of going back in time and independently verifying this. So we're just trying to use these tools as a way of testing hypotheses in this framework. And we looked at a really spectacular group of birds. The phylogeny that contains many of the species that you know and love on your spring bird walks. So all of our warblers, all sparrows found in this hemisphere, cardinals and buntings, blackbirds, and then the huge family of tanagers that's only found in the tropics. And in this group are 120 species of birds that migrate from the temperate zone and the Nearctic region to the neotropical region. So how do we look at their range evolution? Well, when you do a model like this, you have to really simplify things in order to be basically feasible. And so we imagined that we could divide the Western Hemisphere into these three sections, North, Middle, and South America. And then we considered do species breed or winter in these different places. So for example, this is a sagebrush sparrow. That is a short distance migrant, but it spends all year in North America. So its breeding and its wintering range are all within this northern section. So we consider the species range to look like this. Whereas northern Parula, it breeds in North America and almost exclusively winters in the middle zone. So we could characterize its range or simplify its range to look like this. And when we did this for all of those birds in that 750 species phylogeny, we came up with 22 of these little geographic range cartoons that look kind of like dominoes. And so we called this the domino model for bird migration. And what these dominoes represent are the contemporary geographic ranges of species in a very simplified form. And we want to use this phylogeny to reconstruct the history of these ranges in a way that we can kind of compute. Okay, so we're simplifying evolutionary history. And again, I'll skip over all the details, but what we found is painted on this phylogeny, whereas any of these branches that are blue indicate places where migration evolved through a shift of the winter range out of the temperate zone, whereas any of these places that are orange was the opposite pattern, where we have evidence for the breeding range moving. Okay, and this is by modeling how all those little domino ranges could have changed across the phylogenetic history of this group. And so we see that North American ancestry to this neotropical migration in the largest group of birds in this tree. With this method, we found that in the emberizoids, there is a more prevalent number of shifts of the wintering range out of the temperate zone with the evolution of migration, whereas these out of the tropics expansions were somewhat rare. Okay, and again, we can't go back and verify this, but it's a way of basically presenting new information and getting us to think about the evolution of migration differently. And this was fun. When the study came out, it got picked up by what was then a blog by National Geographic by Ed Yong, who you may know now has become rather famous for his writing on the pandemic and on and other aspects of animal biology. Okay, so looking at the geographic history of seasonal migration is kind of this computational approach that's a little bit divorced from the present day. And so after I did this study, I wanted to take a step back and think about, well, how does migration evolve? Which involved addressing this rather simple question of why do birds migrate? Okay, so this involves thinking about, with the tropical home and the temperate home theories, different ideas that people had put forward to understand why bird migration evolved. And so the basic reasoning behind the tropical home theories, that is, why would a bird evolve migration out of the tropics, is that there are a lot of species in the tropics. There may be this struggle for existence, a lot of competition among species. Whereas in the temperate zone, as we're experiencing right now, there's this seasonal flush of resources, okay? All the plants, cherry blossoms flowering, robins gorging their young and themselves on worms. And so there's this flush of resources that must be exploited. And so therefore, species should evolve migration out of the tropics. And the key thing here is that they've, under this hypothesis, they've made kind of the first migration is this exploratory directed, this directed movement towards these resources in order to take advantage of them and raise a lot of young. Excuse me. Now, the basic idea behind the temperate home theories is fairly intuitive, which is that in the temperate zone in the winter, it gets really cold and there isn't a lot of food. And so you better migrate or something bad will happen. And indeed, here's a rather extreme case of that where kingfishers got frozen into the ice, whereas if they had left this region, that would not have happened. I'll let you look up and decide whether you think this is real or fake news, but it could happen. So these are two ways in which migration could evolve. This pressure to exploit the seasonal resources in the temperate zone by tropical organisms, or the deteriorating conditions in the winter in the temperate zone. But can we come up with a more general explanation for the evolution of migration that doesn't rely on where birds were found originally? And I think the way to do that is to distinguish the different kinds of movements that birds make. So birds undergo, and really any organism undergoes, something called dispersal. So migration is a round trip. We know that birds are flying to a location and coming back seasonally, as we define it. Whereas dispersal is usually a shorter movement, and this is any movement that a bird or any animal or even a seed makes from the location where it was born or hatched out of an egg to where it breeds in the next generation. So the distance between where this yellow warbler may have hatched and where it first raises its own young is dispersal. And that's a one-way movement, whereas migration is this round trip. And so rather than thinking about migration as this actual migration out of the tropics towards the temperate zone, I think it's helpful to think of it like this. Whereas we can imagine a location where maybe across the Western Hemisphere, seasonality goes from low to high. So if we think about Mexico and Middle America, there's a little bit less seasonality than there is in the desert southwest of the US or North America. Okay, so there's this gradient in how severe the seasonality is. And we can imagine birds making little dispersal movements, okay, changing the location of their nest into a location that is more seasonal than their ancestors experienced. And so when they do that, when they raise young in a new location that is more seasonal, when the winter comes, they have to respond in some way. And if they don't do anything, like this red X, then they will die. They will become those kingfishers trapped in the ice. Whereas if they leave, that's essentially the evolution of migration. It's a response to seasonality. And migration is one response that organisms make to seasonality, but of course, hibernation or turtles spending the winter under, in the mud at the bottom of a pond, trees losing their leaves. These are all other kinds of responses to the same seasonality, but those are less accessible to birds physiologically. So once we get these seasonally adapted populations, then migration can evolve. So the key thing here is that migration hasn't evolved as this sort of escape from the tropics, but rather a response to increasing seasonality across space or through time. So for the bird watchers out there, maybe you've seen this painted redstart in Southeast Arizona or Big Bend in Texas. It's found in these beautiful pine oak canyons. And in most of its range in Mexico, it is a non-migratory bird, as shown in purple, whereas it's only migratory in the very northern part of its range, where it just lives in the summer. And so it's very easy to imagine migration evolving this way in this species, where maybe some dispersed a little further north. And if they didn't evolve the ability to leave in the winter, they would not survive and persist in these locations, and we wouldn't be fortunate to see them in Arizona. Very rarely in birds, a different strategy has evolved, such as this common porwheel, which is one of the few birds known to go into some kind of torpor that almost approximates hibernation. And some poor whales will migrate, but some in the high deserts out west will not. And they have been found essentially in a deep torpor. So it's an unusual alternative response to seasonality in birds. So if we consider migration an adaptive response to seasonality, rather than kind of an exploratory movement, then I think it's pretty conceptually similar to other strategies that other forms of life use. So bears hibernating, trees losing their leaves. Migration is the strategy that many birds, insects, and other mammals and fish use to deal with seasonality. Okay, and so migration under this definition doesn't exactly evolve out of the tropics, but species that originated in the tropics a long time ago could become migratory if they have to respond to the seasonality as their ranges move. So that's all well and good, but escaping from seasonality is just one half of the story, and this was rather pointedly brought to my attention through a New Yorker cartoon, which is, it's always great when your research program can essentially be boiled down to one New Yorker cartoon. But these birds asking themselves, what I don't get is why once we fly south, we don't just stay there. Okay, and this is actually a troubling question for ornithologists. And most answers to this question are related to the same ideas from the tropical home theory, that birds would come back to the temperate zone to improve their reproductive success because of that flush of resources. And that's certainly part of it, but I think there's actually a more general explanation. And to highlight this, I want to get back to our blackpoll warbler here, which is the species that does this long journey. And I told you that scientists attach these geolocators to these birds. Now, what I didn't say at the beginning is that these geolocators don't transmit any information, okay? They just log information on where the bird was, but the battery life is not good enough to send this information to a receiver or someone's smartphone, okay? So what that means is that to learn about where this bird spent the winter, a scientist has to recapture that bird the next year. And this has actually been successful for the remarkable reason that these species that do these long migrations come back to the very same breeding locations. And I mean the very same breeding locations, because you could imagine that if you were trying to catch a bird in Churchill, Manitoba that you caught the year before, and it flew, it settled a kilometer away in the middle of a swamp, you would never be able to see it again. But these birds reliably come back, and it makes it possible for us to track these migratory birds. So my point here is that migratory birds have a high degree of site faithfulness, or what we could call philopatry, which is a love of home in a more poetic rendering. And so adult migratory birds tend to return to their same breeding sites every year. Young ones disperse a little bit more. And there is very good evidence from a lot of many decades of studies of bird reproduction that the birds that return the earliest in the spring and set up their nests most efficiently end up having a higher reproductive success. That is, they lay more eggs, they raise more young if they get an early start. And I think they can get an early start, or at least be very efficient, if they know where they're coming back to. That is, there are evolutionary benefits to coming back to that same familiar place to breed, because if they bred there in one year, it's a pretty good indication that they could successfully breed there the next year. And so for this reason, there's a very high site fidelity. And I think this site fidelity underlies the evolution of bird migration, because these birds are essentially flying all this way just to come back to the same place where they know they can raise young. And I have tried to describe this through a red queen metaphor, which is popular in biology for various reasons, but it refers to Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, where the red queen says to Alice, takes all the running you can do just to stay in the same place. And so I think that's how we can think about bird migration, is that they do all this flying just to come back to the same place. Okay, so to wrap up this section, I think that migration evolves as a strategy to escape seasonality, but that return journey is driven by the benefit not of going to the temperate zone per se, but simply to returning to a familiar location to breed where they have a good chance of being successful. And I think that it's very useful to think about the evolution of migration similar to the evolution of hibernation or deciduousness in trees as a response for dealing with seasonality. So this is kind of me waving my hands and making some arguments about bird migration. So is any of this stuff testable? And this is where I want to get back to our spring birding and the mouse-elephant life history continuum. Okay, so um, you may have noticed throughout the talk that there is this tension in migration between reproduction and survival. And so going back to the black-billed warbler, this annual cycle is very much connected to a balance between survival and reproduction. So they breed up in the northern taiga and they fly all this way to South America to survive the year so that they can come back. And survival and reproduction is a trade-off across much of many ways of organizing biology. Okay, so there's a tension between survival and reproduction that is captured by this mouse elephant or slow fast continuum of life history, where on the one hand we have these live fast die young species, and on the other hand we have our elephants or our albatross that lay very few eggs or have very few young, but they survive very well. Okay. And one of the things you may notice immediately about the slow fast continuum is that body size is an important variable here. So faster organisms tend to be smaller and larger organisms tend to have a slower life history, such as the albatross and the elephant. Okay. But other aspects of the environment or other traits that species have can influence where they sit on the slow fast continuum of life history. So where does migration put birds on the slow fast continuum of life history? And we started asking this question by looking at how migration influences annual fecundity, which just means basically the number of offspring produced in a year. And so annual fecundity in birds can be simplified to clutch size. So how many eggs does a bird lay? And you can see in this heat map that birds in the temperate zone, especially in the northern hemisphere, tend to lay 4 to 5 eggs with every clutch. Okay, whereas in the tropics, in the humid tropics, we tend to see smaller clutch sizes where birds are often laying 2 eggs or sometimes only 1. And we know that there are more migratory birds at higher latitudes. So here's a heat map of the proportion of birds that are migratory in a community. And of course, more species are migratory in the temperate zone than there are in the tropics. So if we just looked at these 2 data points, we could, and kind of birds globally, we would see that our clutch sizes suggest that migration, seasonal migration, may promote fecundity or reproduction. Okay, so maybe birds are migratory birds could be living faster by producing more young. How about survival? Well, let's think about, I've already talked about the black-billed warbler enough, but how about these bar-tailed godwits that breed in the North Slope of Alaska and fly all the way across the Pacific, sometimes in one leap that takes more than a week of a nonstop flight to winter in the Southern Hemisphere on Pacific Islands and in New Zealand. Truly remarkable journey. All kinds of dangers and weather systems getting in their way. It must be very risky to their survival, right? So sort of intuitively, migration must be pretty hard on annual survival. But let's think about for a bird breeding in Alaska or in the temperate zone in New York, let's say. How does this cost of migrating a long distance compare to the cost of not migrating? So if you're this hermit thrush, an insectivore or sometimes a frugivore that has to survive the winter survive a cold snap, or these tiny little golden crowned kinglets, which are some of the smallest birds to survive a northern winter. This must be pretty hard as well. So the central question here is asking, how does migration distance influence the balance of annual survival and reproduction, or that slow-fast continuum across species? And really what we're asking here, do long-distance migrants live fast and die young? And to do this, one of my graduate students and I, we looked at birds that breed in the boreal region. So essentially all across Canada, into the Adirondack Mountains and the Maritimes, 40 species of migratory birds that are familiar parts of this environment. And this is a good system because the latitude and location where the species are breeding is constant, but these species migrate to a wide variety of locations. So each one of these curved lines indicates approximate migration of these different species to their very different non-breeding locations. So we can return to our spring bird walks here. We know that the yellow rump warbler spends the winter pretty close in the temperate zone, and it arrives early, whereas that black Bernardian warbler is one of those long distance migrants that doesn't show up until May. But again, it's the first one out, and the shorter distance migrants linger longer. And it turns out that across boreal breeding birds, we see this pattern very clearly. So on the horizontal axis here, I show migration distance for a species, how far they're flying from breeding to non-breeding locations. And on the vertical axis, we see essentially the length of the breeding season, or the days between spring and fall migration. This is actually data we got from eBird contributions. So basically, birds that are migrating further are spending less time on their breeding grounds than birds that are migrating shorter distances from the temperate zone. And on the right, we have just a different way of showing that same data with kind of the calendar period that is covered by species that are migrating shorter versus longer. Okay, so we have some evidence that the breeding season is shorter in long distance migrants. So that begs this question then, well, if the breeding season is shorter, how does this annual fecundity scale with migration distance? And when we looked across those 40 species and we looked at their clutch sizes and how many broods they produce each year, we found that actually long distance migrants produce fewer young each year than short distance migrants. And we know from life history theory that survival should trade off with fecundity. So if long distance migratory birds are producing fewer young per year, they should have higher survival. Now, is that possible that these long distance migrants like blackpoll warblers have higher annual survival than short distance migrants? So to get at this, we actually looked at a really cool database called Vital Rates of North American Land Birds. And this is not vital rates like their blood pressure and oxygen, but rather the rates of their populations. So is the population growing? How much are individuals surviving each year? How many young are they producing? And this is done by year after year, ornithologists studying bird populations by doing a misnetting program in their breeding locations and tracking who comes back and who doesn't. So we had data available on annual survival. And annual survival is essentially the probability that an individual survives from one year to the next. And we found that across species, the annual survival of the longer distance migrants was higher relative to their body size than the short distance migrants. So we did actually find evidence that these long distance migrants are surviving better. And so what this means is that the longer distance migrants kind of counterintuitively have a slower life history. So a species like a yellow rump warbler has higher annual fecundity and may be able to produce more than one brood in a year, and lower survival because it's spending the winter in a harsher location, and it is a faster life history, more like a mouse. Whereas that black Bernardian warbler is producing fewer young, but it's actually surviving better, even though it's flying all the way to Peru or Bolivia and back again. So its life history is more like an elephant. It's a little bit of a stretch, but you can take the analogy. So what does this mean? Well, our proposed explanation for this is that, as I said, migration distance lowers the time available for breeding, okay, because those birds are on a tight schedule, and it reduces their fecundity. And because their fecundity is reduced and they produce fewer young every year, essentially these birds can only survive that long migration if they're really good at it. Okay, so they, or I should say, these bird populations can only persist if they're really good at migration and their annual survival is high. If annual survival was not as high as it is in long distance migratory birds, their populations would start to decline because they're not producing enough young year after year. So that those extreme migrations really demand a high survival rate. Whereas this investment in the long distance migration also confers or yields a high survival because they're going to places like the humid tropics where there's lots of food during the winter, and they can survive that winter better than, say, a hermit thrush or a yellow-rumped warbler trying to eke it out in southern New York in a fluctuating winter. So back to these godwits, it turns out there's been some great tracking studies of these, and they too have very remarkably high adult survival. So these birds can only pull off these long distance migrations if they've evolved to be extremely good at it. And so their survival is much higher year to year than is kind of intuitive for us, given the journeys that they're going on. So back to the evolution of migration, as birds have colonized higher latitudes, it actually results in a faster life history compared to tropical organisms. But the evolution of migration, long distance migration, has really slowed this life history down, and it highlights migration as this survival strategy that allows species to persist in these really seasonal environments. Okay, so I've thrown a lot at you, but just to kind of summarize where we've been, migration is a geographically complicated phenomenon, and kind of difficult to even conceive the different ways that it may have evolved. But we have some phylogenetic evidence that migration has often evolved through changes of the wintering range away from the temperate zone into the tropics. And I think that to really understand this, we have to consider migration as analogous to other responses to seasonality, such as hibernation. And we've learned that long distance migrants promotes that high annual survival relative to not migrating or wintering in the temperate zone, and highlights migration as this survival strategy that allows birds to migrate these long distances just so they can survive better and return to those same places year after year to breed. Now, I just want to end, unfortunately, on a not happy note, which is, I'm sure many of you know that long distance migratory birds, all migratory birds, but especially long distance migratory birds, are experiencing major population declines. And I think this research on life history really highlights why that is that long distance migrants are producing fewer offspring per year. And the existence of these long distance migrations is really predicated on them having high survival during the non-breeding season and migration. And so all the anthropogenic impacts of artificial light and habitat loss, anything that depresses their survival, will lead to a population decline pretty quickly, because they don't have the luxury of being able to simply produce more young each year. So sorry to end on a sad note, but I was glad to hear you doing some conservation at the beginning. So just want to thank my collaborators and lab members. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very, very much, Ben, for a fascinating lecture. And as you noted, migration is something that we're all familiar with, even if we're rooted in one spot here in New York. And really, when you think about it, it's absolutely marvelous that these birds are able to do this, and fly these long distances every year. I see we have a couple of questions, and by all means, other audience members, participants, do send in your questions. Um, and so one is, uh, yeah, the question: why did you organize the domino based on latitude rather than temperature?
Sure, yeah, thanks. Essentially, the goal there was to reconstruct geography. And so we just needed a way to um, break down in a very simple way where species are spending the winter, or sorry, where they're spending the breeding season and the non-breeding season. So it's looking at how temperature or precipitation correlates with migration would be a really interesting um, different avenue of research for sure.
Another question is, uh, can you say how human-induced climate change is altering migration patterns?
Sure. Certainly that is a big topic. How is climate change affecting migratory patterns? And the major ways in which this is thought to affect migratory animals is through changes in the timing, through changes in their ranges, or through changes in their habitat availability. For timing, these migratory strategies have evolved over a long time, and they are evolved to be in sync with the spring. Okay, so the emergence of resources in the spring. And so if we have an earlier spring where plants and flowers come out earlier, all the insects will come out earlier. And so birds may arrive a little bit after that peak. And so it's been suggested for a long time that birds could be in trouble because their migratory patterns could be kind of decoupled from spring phenology. There's been a lot of research showing that that is true, that that is happening, but not necessarily in the same way for every species. So nothing's ever as simple as we want it to be, but certainly changes in phenology are a big reason.
Let me just interpolate a question of my own there, which is very closely related to that, which is that is there a difference in that respect between birds that migrate relatively short distances, let's say from New York to Virginia or Georgia, versus those that migrate to say South America? Because the ones that migrate to South America have absolutely no way of knowing what the course of seasonal change is up here, near their breeding grounds, whereas the ones that are wintering closer are more likely to be experiencing seasonal changes that are correlated with those to the north in their breeding area. So
Right.
they would have, in some sense, different information about when would be a suitable time to move. Is there any thought on that, and or any evidence on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So these long distance migrants that are spending the winter in South America or further, or southern South America, or in southern Africa, if they're European breeding birds. Yeah, that's right. They don't, they can't read the weather report from thousands of kilometers away. So they have to be relying on other things like changing day length and cues that are probably more fixed evolutionarily. And so they, would not be altering their spring departure in response to changes in the weather here. So that has been predicted for a while. The thing about spring migration is that birds can, they can stop along the way. And so a bird migrating from South America may arrive in, Alabama or coastal Texas or somewhere, and still have some ability to modulate what
Mhm.
happens next based on the environment. And so that relationship between migration distance and sort of the uncoupling of phenology is maybe not as clean as would have been predicted. I've
Mhm.
seen more research suggesting that actually one of the big differences is Eastern North American birds versus Western North American birds, where we have these very different spring dynamics and precipitation regimes, snowpacks, and so forth. Um, so yeah, I think that needs to be more research there.
Mhm. Frank asks, a recent lecture from the Neotropical Bird Club highlighted new research on migration within South America, particularly by flycatchers. Are you aware of this new research, which, to the best of my understanding, does not challenge your arguments?
Sure, yeah.
So there
Well,
certainly is a lot of migration within South America. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I don't know the specific lecture, but there's been some great research on birds, including flycatchers that migrate within the tropics or within South America. And um, yeah, so migratory, there's a great diversity of migratory strategies in birds. And sometimes when we look at just these long distance migrants that, we see in the temperate zone, uh, we overlook the fact that there's this wider diversity. Um, and but ultimately, I think that migration is still evolving in similar ways as responses to seasonality, or then that could be in the tropics, that could be changes in precipitation over relatively small areas, for example.
Yeah, I I just like to mention there that occasionally we see the outcome up here of migration within South America. For example, fork-tailed flycatchers, which do that apparently sometimes just keep going and they end up in New York and Massachusetts and places like that. And last year there was a gray-breasted martin in Brooklyn that might again illustrate that point. Yeah.
Yeah.
So. Um, Question, is habitat loss a big factor in the decline of long distance migrants?
For sure. Unfortunately, yes. And that is true in the places where they spend the winter, in the tropics, but it's also the places they need to stop along the way. And I don't want to pin all of the habitat loss problems on dynamics happening in the tropical wintering ranges. I've spent a lot of time in doing field work and throughout the boreal region on these birds, and even in places that seems like on a map are fairly pristine boreal forests. There's still a tremendous amount of pressure from deforestation going on in places that
Mm,
may seem remote and untouched. So I think habitat loss is absolutely a major factor
yeah.
on both ends of the journey.
Um, well, this is a little peripheral in some way, as you will say, taxonomically. Is migratory distance in butterflies also affected by fecundity and longevity?
That's a great question. And butterfly migration just makes my head hurt to think about, because it is even more complicated than bird migration, in the sense that we have different generations of butterflies doing different things. Um, so I think that the other thing, there are somewhat fewer species of migratory butterflies to compare with. So I'm not sure that we have the data to make those comparative assessments of generation time and lifespan. And it would have to be done in a kind of a totally different way. But I think that's a really fair and interesting question for sure. But I can't answer it.
Okay. Here's a question that's closely related to one that occurred to me also. I Ralph asks, I can understand how dispersal can lead to shorter distance migration. But how does this come into play with the long distance migrants like the godwits? It seems they have to fly over a very long distance over environments that are not suitable to them. And the same was occurring to me. I mean, how do they ever evolve something like, a long transoceanic migration pattern? How did they ever find that wintering ground in the first place, so to speak? I mean,
Yeah,
how does that evolve?
great. Yeah, that's a question I've spent probably too much time hand wringing over. And I think that I think it gets back to this idea that geographic ranges are not static; they change a lot through time. And so when I see something like the bar-tailed godwit that has this extraordinarily specific migratory journey from a little breeding range to a little wintering range, I wonder how big was that species range in the past? So was are we looking at the relic of a species that was much more widely distributed across the Arctic, let's say, and had a wider wintering range, and we've just seen this sort of extinction till all we have left is this one population that does this one very specific thing. So that's one possibility, is that these kind of that there's sort of the ghost of extinction here. But the other thing is that as long as a migratory strategy works, it will persist. And so that's kind of one of the points I've been trying to make about survival, is that I think it's actually less it's harder to make an argument about this leap from, let's say, the wintering range in New Zealand, how they started breeding in Alaska. I think it's a little easier to conceptualize that if some population of godwits started wintering a location, as long as they survived the year and it served to allow them to come back in the spring, then that route can persist and evolve. And we do see cases of birds getting lost or blown off course, and most of the time they die. But if they survive the winter in that new location and they go back and raise young, then in theory, that new migratory journey, which could be a big leap, could expand in the population. So that's my convoluted answer.
What what can you say about long distance migrants that have low clutch sizes, such as common nighthawks? Is this expected, or are you surprised by small clutches?
Uh, yeah. So, essentially, different lineages have, different constraints on their clutch sizes. And so that's going to be always modulated by their survival. So if an animal has a small clutch, it will be kind of balanced by their survival rates throughout the year. And so, for a long distance migrant like a common nighthawk, I would expect them to have pretty high survival, interannual survival, that would essentially allow their population to persist even despite that they may raise not that many young per year.
Okay, Megan says, thank you for this talk. And she's got a big question here. Big picture, do the same conditions exist for migrants between Africa and Europe, or between South Asia and North Asia? And I think she means the same patterns that you described for North America, for the Americas, for the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, well, certainly we see the same kind of latitudinal migrations between Palearctic and Africa. There has been, for the clutch size study, there has been another study on European breeding species, and they found similar things. I'm not sure about the Asian migratory systems, but yeah, someone will have to take a look at it. And things get quite complicated as you get into tropical Asia, where there are short distance migrations, and you start getting into austral migrations with species flying, breeding and wintering ranges being flipped, of course. So I haven't spent as much time thinking about that, but great question.
Not sure I see any more questions pending, but I have one or two, and one is, and this is kind of related to the question about very long distance migrants such as the godwit, but my question is, how do you how did a migratory path over a long hostile environment evolve in the first place? I mean, something like ruby-throated hummingbirds flying over the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, I would have thought that there must have been an awful lot of individuals who might have ventured that and didn't, and perished before you had the chance to establish a population that had that migratory route.
Yeah, no, it's at some level it's wild they can do it. One of the things that I think is remarkable to think about with birds is I think there is some uh, physiological evidence that for migration, the hard part isn't really the flight. Um, Birds are really, really quite efficient flyers, and of course, some better than others. But the real challenging and risky part of migration, I think, is when they're stopping over, can they fuel up? Can they survive a cold night if it occurs on their migration and so forth? Um, so not to skirt your question about how this evolves, but I think that maybe they're not quite as challenged by that aspect of migration as seems kind of intuitive to us. But yes, of course, I think you know it must be there must be some gradual aspect to it. So we wouldn't expect a tropical bird all of a sudden to evolve this long distance flight. But if hummingbirds are flying around the Gulf of Mexico or making shorter distance leaps, then perhaps that initial Gulf crossing isn't quite as dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, okay. So here's another question. What of east to west migration, such as the geese that go between Europe and Asia and even over the Himalayas?
Yeah, I mean, the general aspects of all these migrations is that if, whatever the migratory pattern is, if it allows that bird to survive the harsher season, and come back and raise its young again, then that strategy will work. And it's not just about coming back at all, but to come back efficiently. And so, yeah, those bar-headed geese that cross the Himalaya, I can't imagine anything more humbling than summiting Mount Everest and seeing a flock of geese flying overhead. But for them, it works and it returns them to where they need to go each year.
Right. Um, there are some birds that show well the reverse pattern of what you've been talking about, such as well, or just in general on an evolutionary time scale. You've had a number of cases in which species have evolved from tropical ancestors and basically sort of colonize the temperate zone and become migratory in the process. So orioles are an example of that. Our orioles are derived from tropical ancestors. Um, and and I'm wondering if what the things you've been talking about apply to them. That is, what would have been the selective advantage of leaving the tropics, to spend part of the year very far away and after a hazardous journey. You know,
Sure, yeah. A great question. Yeah, so I think this gets back to that sort of dispersal issue where I don't think that they evolved migration by sort of leaving the tropics per se. I think it's more likely that the sort of typical range expansion that any species could undergo, whether it's a plant
mhm,
or an animal, that gradually they would find themselves in a more seasonal environment and then evolve migration.
mhm,
And it doesn't mean that their current day distributions have to span that gradient, because through time there could be, extinction of that kind of middle population. But I do think it's more likely that those species still, um, even if they come from tropical lineages, that they disperse into more seasonal environments and evolve migration in response to that seasonality, as opposed to somehow, yeah, knowing where to go out of the tropics on a longer migration.
mhm. Do we have any notion? So, I mean, migration has evolved independently in many, many different lineages. Do we have any notion at all about what the actual mechanisms are and the genetic basis of it? It seems like a very complex, thing to do that you would think would have a pretty complex genetic basis and be and be relatively improbable, but it's
Yeah.
happened. It's evolved again and again and again. And any sense about that, about
Yeah.
how hard is it to evolve a migratory habit from a non-migratory?
That's a great question. So the sort of um prevailing wisdom, I guess, in ornithology is that it's very easy to evolve migration. Um, I think that that is a little bit of a biased view from looking at certain species like the black-capped warbler, where we have these little migratory and non-migratory populations, and they can kind of switch very quickly. So I think among birds that are part of groups that migrate, I think migration can change very rapidly.
Hmm.
But I think that it takes longer and is a little harder if we kind of broaden that taxonomic scope. Um, and as as far as I mean, on the other hand, it could be that the ancestral bird was migratory, and what we're seeing is just changes since then. One of the things we're studying in my lab now is the evolution of bird magnetoreception, so how birds use the magnetic field of the Earth to navigate, because that requires specific sensory systems, specific genes, specific parts of the brain that are, in a lot of ways, still pretty mysterious. But we're interested in whether flycatchers that may have evolved migration somewhat independently than, say, sparrows, whether they are using the magnetic or whether they can all sense the magnetic fields and whether they do so differently using different genes. And I don't have an answer yet, but yeah, for that the reason the basis of your question is why we're interested in studying these mechanistic things.
Sure. Well, let us know when you've got the answers to those questions, and we'll be happy to hear them again.
Great.
Thank you very much, Ben, for a fascinating talk. As you can tell from the questions, it was, clearly something that we in this audience can relate to, and we really appreciate a really interesting talk. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Doug, and yeah, thanks to all of you for listening and again for the invitation, and get out birding.